What's going on, guys? Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Amigos Code. In this video, you're going to learn pretty much everything you need to know about JWT using Spring Boot 3. So about 3 weeks ago, we posted a crash course on Spring Security, and there was a lag with JWT section. So we decided to re-record the entire section and actually make it so extensive. This crash course right here is brought to you by Ali Boo and is the one that led the Spring Security. So go ahead and subscribe to his channel, show some love, because he's going to be bringing you awesome content like this from time to time. Security is a must when designing and building APIs, and it's really important that you understand JWT so that you can secure your APIs. Before we crack on, literally just take 1 second and smash that like button. Also, if you're new to the channel, subscribe, and if you haven't joined the private Facebook group as well as Discord, go ahead and join because the community is growing and we're waiting for you. So without further ado, let's kick off. I just want to say that you can grab the entire source code and the description of this video so that if you have any issues or you want to take what you learned from this course and then apply it within your own API, you can do so. Feel free to clone the repo and just use the code as you intend. And if you have questions regarding JWT, literally just ask on the community and someone within the community will be able to help you.
Before we start the implementation process, let me first explain to you how this JWT validation mechanism works. The whole story starts when a customer and a client send an HTTP request to our backend system, which is running using Spring Boot container running on an Apache Tomcat embedded server. So just a reminder for you, the first thing that gets executed within a Spring application is the filter. So anytime and each time you create a filter, just notice and remember that it will be the first thing that gets executed within our application. So in this case, the first thing that will be executed is our JWT Authentication filter. And this is only a once per request filter and has the role to validate and check everything regarding the token or the JWT token that we have. So now let's start the process. The first thing that will happen, we will have here an internal check to check if we have the JWT token or not. So if the token is missing, as we can see here, we will send a 403 response to the client. So, and the reason is this missing JWT. All right, so now we have our JWT token, and then after that, we will start the process or the validation process. So this validation process will start in this way. So the filter, like the internal execution, will first make a call using the UserDetails service to try to fetch the user information from the database. And this we will base on the user email that we will set as a claim or a token subject that we will extract within this JWT authentication filter. So I repeat again. This JWT authentication filter will check the JWT token, extract the username or the email, or we call it the subject when we talk about JWT tokens, and it will use that email to fetch the user details information from our database. Okay, so this is the first call. Then once the user is fetched, we have the response from our database, and the response can be either way, can be existing user or non-existing user. Okay, so once we get the response to our JWT authentication filter, here we will make a few checks, which is if the user does not exist, we will also send a 403 to our customer. In case everything is fine and we get our user from the database, we will start then a validation process. So this validation process, because this JWT token was generated for a specific user, so we want to validate this token based on the user. And here we have this validate JWT process or mechanism, which will try to call a JWT service. And this JWT service will take as parameter the user itself and also the token or the string token or the JWT token, call it whatever you want. After the execution of this validation process, here we have two case scenario. So the first one, the token is not valid, so it's not, so for example, the token is expired or the token is not for that specific user. So what we do, we will send also a 403 back to our customer. So, and the reason will be this invalid JWT token. Otherwise, what will happen, we will call or we will update the security context holder and set this connected user, because when we fetch the user details information from the database, we will be able to set this security context holder. So we will tell Spring, or we will tell the set or the rest of our filter chain that this user is now authenticated, and we will update the authentication manager. So every time we check if this user is authenticated for this request, the answer will be yes. Once the security context holder will be updated, it will automatically dispatch the request, and it will be sent to the dispatcher servlet, and from the dispatcher servlet it will be sent directly to the controller. We will do all the execution that we need to do, for example calling the service, going to the database, and so on and so forth, and then we will send back a response. For example, it can be a JWT and it will be a HTTP 200 or whatever, any process that will get executed within this controller. So this is how JWT authentication mechanism works. Now let me show you how to implement this and how to realize these steps. Let's first start by creating a new Spring Boot project. To do so, the recommended way, and the way I also recommend, is going to start.spring.io, which is the Spring initializer, and create a new project from that. So first of all, make sure you use Maven. This is what I will be using in this video and tutorial. Then we want to use the recent version of Spring Boot, which is now 3.01. Okay, and also here make sure you select Java 17, because the minimum required version which is compatible with Spring 3 is Java 17. Next, select the jar packaging, and now let's fill this project metadata. So for the group ID, I will call it com.alibu, and the artifact I will call it security. Okay, so I will leave the rest as it is, and now I will move on and add some dependencies. So first of all, we need the Spring Web because we want to expose few endpoints. We need also the security, and this is the main object of this video. And then we will need JPA or Spring Data JPA, because we need to manipulate and interact with a database. Then we need a PostgreSQL driver to connect to PostgreSQL. You can also use any other SQL database like MySQL or Oracle or whatever. Finally, we want to use Lombok to reduce the boilerplate code. So now we have our project ready. We can just go ahead, click on generate, and start coding. As I mentioned before, we will be using PostgreSQL as a database for this application. So let's first start by configuring our data source. For that, I will be using IntelliJ and I will use this database tool. So this one is available only with the ultimate version. Otherwise, if you don't have the ultimate version, just make sure you install PostgreSQL and you can use the PG admin, or you can use the dbeaver tool to connect to any data source. Okay, so let's start with that. Click on here and then we have this plus icon. So click on this plus icon and then we want data source and then filter for PostgreSQL. Click on that. And to be able to connect, so make sure here, if this is the first time, you will have, instead of driver PostgreSQL, you will have a link or you will have a button here to download the driver. So just go ahead and click on it and download the driver. Next, the host is localhost because it's the local one. And the default port for PostgreSQL is 5432. Then when you created your PostgreSQL, did you made or did you choose a username and password? If yes, so just go ahead and specify them here. So for me, for the purpose of this tutorial, I made it Amigos Code, and for the password, it's just password. Okay. And then once you fill all this information, just to check if everything is working fine, click on this test connection and make sure you get this succeeded. Otherwise, just check your configuration. All right, so now everything is done. I will go ahead and click on OK. And the first thing that I will do is I will create a new database. So right click on this data source, new, and then database. So I will call it JWT security. And then hit OK. So the first time it will not be automatically shown. So just click here on this 2 of 8. The numbers might change from one laptop to another. And here I want this JWT security. Okay, so open it in here, and here we can see that we have 0 of 3 schemas. Just select the public one because this is the one we need, and this is where we will find all our tables once we create them. So now we have our data source available. Let's move on to the next step. Now let's establish a connection between our application and the database we just created. So the first thing to do is go here to this application properties and rename it and use the representation YAML. Okay, so this is what I prefer personally, and you can keep properties if you want to, but to better follow this tutorial, it's better to transform it to YAML. So in order to connect to a database, we need to provide a bunch of properties right here. So we will start with Spring and then data source. And one of the things that we need to provide at first is the URL. And this one is a URL or the connection string to our database. If you don't know it, just go here to this database, click on it, right click on the connection you just created, properties, and you copy this one. You copy this part right here. It's gdbc:/PostgreSQL and then the address port / the database. So let me close this. I will paste this one and make sure here you write the correct database name. So for us, we called it JWT security. Now we need to provide the username and password. Okay, so for my case, it's empty. Make sure you provide the correct one. And here it's password. So next property is, after providing the data source information, we want now to give some other JPA properties. Okay, so here it will be JPA and then Hibernate. And here I want to tell Spring what to do at the startup or at that application startup. And this property is the DDL auto. And here we have a bunch of options. So we have create drop, create, none, update, and validate. So I will be using the first one because every time I want to start the application, I want to create a new database, a new schema, and when I stop the application, I want to destroy it. Okay, so I always want to start with empty database. All right, so the next one within JPA, like you see now, you need to really pay attention about the indentation right here, because this DDL auto is part of the Hibernate, and the one I will write right now is part of JPA. So it's Spring JPA and then show SQL. I want to show SQL when we perform, or when Spring Data JPA performs a query, I want to see that query. Okay, I want also to add some other properties. So here I will type properties, and one of these properties, and here I have Hibernate, and within this Hibernate I want also to format the SQL. So format SQL true. I want my queries to be formatted. Now go back to the same level as properties and provide some information about the database. So here we want to tell JPA which database we are using, and for this case we are using PostgreSQL. And then we can also provide the database platform that we are using, and this will help Spring performing and writing the better queries to suit our PostgreSQL database. So for this one, it's org.hibernate.dialect.PostgreSQL dialect. All right, and here we just forgot one property right here, which is the driver class name. So this will help Spring to detect or use the best driver class name. And here we are using PostgreSQL, so IntelliJ will automatically propose it to you. Otherwise, it's the org.postgresql.driver, and this is the one that we got from the PostgreSQL driver dependency. All right, so that's it about this configuration. Let's move on and start implementing our security. When we talk about authorization and authentication, we mainly talk about users. So let's go ahead and create our user class. So within the Java package and within the main package that we have right here, right click and new class, and here we can create a package and a class at the same time. So the package, I will call it user, and here I will just call the class user. So user.user will create a package user, and inside of it, it will create a class user. All right, so this is our user class. Let me make this one full screen. And now I want to write a bunch of properties within this class. Okay, so my user has the following characteristics or the following fields. So first of all, I want to have an integer ID, and then I want to have a string first name and private string last name. And also, of course, we need an email and password for this user to be able to authenticate and connect to our application. So here I will add email and also private string password. So these are the information about our user. Now I will add a bunch of Lombok annotations in order to reduce the boilerplate, because you know, when we create a class, we need getters and setters, we need constructors, we need also the design pattern builder to be able to easily build our object, and so forth. So let's start with that. So we will need the date annotation, and this annotation will provide us is the equivalent of getter setter, as you can see here. So it generates getters for all fields for use for methods to string and so on and so forth. So it's the equivalent to the getter setter required as constructor to string and equals and hash code. Okay. Also, I want to use the builder annotation. So this builder annotation will help me build my object in an easy way using the design pattern builder. Okay, and also I will need the noargs constructor, and of course when we talk about design pattern builder, we need always the all args constructor. Okay, so let's add this one, and like this we have our user class. Now let's make this user class an entity. To make this user class an entity, so the first thing we need to add is this entity annotation. And since we are using the Spring Boot 3.0, here make sure that the package is jakarta.persistence and it's no longer javax.persistence. So this also will help you tell if you are using the correct version of Spring Boot. Okay. So here we need the entity annotation, and because this username, this user class is already reserved for PostgreSQL, because PostgreSQL already has a table called user, so we cannot create a second table called user. I will use the table annotation right here, because you know the table annotation, if I do not provide if I don't provide any name right here, it will take the entity or the class name as a default name for the table. Okay, but here I want just to call it underscore user to avoid this ambiguity between this user class and the one with PostgreSQL. So now this is kind of sufficient to tell that this user class now is an entity, but we still need to provide one small information. Okay, so here we have this error right here. We see that this persistence entity user should have a primary key. Okay, so we need to add an ID attribute, which we already have right here, but we're still missing this ID annotation. So this ID annotation, it's coming from the jakarta.persistence, and it's telling that this ID is the unique identifier of this user class. Now I want also this ID to be auto incremented or auto generated. So every time I want to create user, I don't need to provide this ID, and every time this ID is null, I want it to be auto incremented by the system or by Spring Data JPA itself. So to do so and to make it in an easy way, I will use the annotation generated value. Okay, so this generated value, it will make this ID or this object auto-generated using whether a sequence, a table, and so on and so forth. And we call this a strategy. So for this strategy, we have several options. Okay, we have auto, identity, sequence, table, and UUID. So the auto is the default value. Identity means that it will use an identity number, like an auto increment. Sequence means that we will create a sequence within our database and use this sequence to increment each time the value of the ID. The table, this means that we will create a table in the database, and we will call it, by default it's called Hibernate sequence, and this table will always be requested and queried by Spring Data JPA to get the last value and increment it for the last one. The UUID is using this one. I think you know it from the JWTs. But if you leave it to auto, if you leave the generation type to auto, Hibernate will try to detect the best suitable option for you. For example, if we are using PostgreSQL, it will pick by default sequence. If you are using MySQL, for example, it will pick table because MySQL does not work with sequences, so it will pick table for that. So for the moment, I will just keep it empty like this, because as I mentioned, the default value is auto, so it will be automatically detected. Okay, so now we have our entity. Let's try to start the application and make sure that we have our table created within the database. Here, enable the annotation processing for Lombok, and now we have our application started. Let's have a look quickly on the logs, and here we see that create sequence, user sequence start with 1, increment by 50. This is automatically generated as I mentioned, and here we see the SQL that we have create table user with an ID, email, and so on and so forth. Okay, and here we have Spring Security is auto generating a security password, and this one we will see later on. Okay, so also if you want to check, you can open your database right here, click on this one, refresh it, and within the public schema we see that we have this user table right here, and if we open it, we will see the ID or the attributes that we already provided. When Spring Security starts and set up the application, it will use an object called UserDetails, and this UserDetails is an interface that contains a bunch of methods. Okay, and each time you want to work with Spring Security, you need to ensure that you are providing this UserDetails object in order to make Spring Security life easy to use. Okay, so to do this for us, for our user, I recommend this way. So every time you have a user, think always to make it or to implement the UserDetails interface, so like that your user or your application user is already a Spring user, if we may say so. Okay, so to do that, just go ahead to this user class that we created and implement an interface called UserDetails. Okay, and this UserDetails is from the package org.spring framework security core UserDetails. Okay, click here, and now it will ask us to implement a bunch of method. So click on this one, implement methods, and we see right here that these are the methods that we want or that we need to auto generate. Okay, not auto generate, but we need to implement. So it's get authorities username, and we have this boolean methods, account expired, locked, and so forth. Okay, so just go ahead, click OK, and we will see how to override. But before that, I want to go a bit more into details about this UserDetails interface. So I will open the definition, download the source, so we can easily see it. So here, if I click on this icon right here to see all the implementation of this interface, we have this mutable user details, and so forth. And also we have our user class, the one that we created. And we can see also that we have this user from Spring Framework Security Core UserDetails. And let's have a look on this one. Okay, so this UserDetail contains the username, password, authorities, and the bunch of booleans, the account expired, locked, non-expired, and enabled or not. And this information or these attributes Spring will use automatically to play with authorization and authentication. And for example, if we can rely on this account non-expired, for if we want to have some expiring dates, or the user can expire, and also if we want to lock and unlock the user, or the same if we want to work with credentials, and so forth. Okay, so I will give you the time to play and check this. And here we see that we have a bunch of constructor, and we have these methods that they need to be overridden right here. Okay, So here we see that this user already implements user details. So for you, you have two options: whether you implement this user details interface within your user class, or you can create, for example, a user, you call it app user, and then extend the user, the one from Spring Boot. So it will be the same, but for me, I want always to have control over my object, so I create my own user class and implement the user details. So now let's go ahead and implement these methods. Okay, so here the first one is we need to provide a collection of granted authorities, and already the method is called get authorities. So these get authorities will return, or should return, a list of roles. Like, let me explain it like that. When we talk about roles, so here we need to add a role. Okay, so I will create a role, and this one, I will create an enum for it, and I will call it role. And this, let's create this class, and here you can choose the option create enum role, hit OK, and we want to create it within the same package. And within this role, it's so easy. I will just user and admin. Okay, so we want to have only two roles within our application. So now we have this role, and because it's an enum, we need to add this enumerated annotation, and this enumerated annotation is to tell Spring that this is an enum, and we want to use it whether the enum type ordinal or string. So by the way, by default it's ordinal, means it's 0, 1, 2, and so on and so forth. String, it will take the string value of the enum. Okay, so let's go back to this get authorities. So in here, because with our design, we said, or we decided that the user can have only one role, so I will just return a list dot of, and here I want to return a new simple granted authority. Okay, so the object that I want to return is called simple granted authority, and here I want to return the role dot name. Okay, so the role is referencing this role right here. Next one is this get username. So the username for us is our username, so it's the email. Okay, then we have this account non-expired. So here we have this is account non-expired. Here make sure and be careful, it's non-expired false. This is the negation, so non-expired should be true, otherwise we will not be able to connect our users. So non-expired, non-logged, and non-credential non-expired, and if the user is enabled, false, and here I want to make it true. Here there is one thing that I need to mention right here. So within this method, let's go back to this user details interface. We see that we have this get password. Okay, but this get password was not overridden right here, because we have this string password right here, and we have the Lombok annotation, so we have already the method called get password. But here, if I just name this one, we will see that here we will automatically tell that we want to override this method. Okay, so let's override it just to be more visible, or like better visible for you. I will rename this one to password, and here for this password I will just return my password. Okay, so I just wanted to mention this one, so in the next time, or like when you have a different name for this password field, you don't get surprised when you see this get password, or when you have this password exactly like that and you don't see it. So now you know the reason why. Okay, so now we have everything we need within our user details. So we created a new role, and we defined all the methods that are required by Spring Security. Now our user is ready, so let's move on and create a repository for that user class. So the repository is the class which is responsible to communicate with the database. So when working with Spring Data JPA, we don't need to create a class. All we need to do is create an interface, and let's call it user repository. And this user repository, to make it a repository, all we need to do is to extend another interface called JPA repository. Okay, and as you can see here, this JPA repository is from Spring Framework Data JPA and so on and so forth, and it's a generic interface that takes a T, so which is the class, and an ID, which should be the ID of our user class. So let's use this one and pass these types. So this the user, and we used integer as an ID, so let's pass integer right here. Okay, so now our repository is ready, and as you know, the Spring Data JPA has also a bunch of methods or ready to use methods like save, find all, find by ID, and so on and so forth. Okay, now I will create one method that we will need later on, and this method will try to retrieve or find a user by email, because email is unique, so we need to find, or we need to fetch a user by its email. All right, so I'm gonna create this optional user, and like optional is a generic type, so it's an optional of user, and here I will use the query method provided by Spring, and I will use the method find by, and here all you need to do is providing the attribute or the field name that you have within your class. So for our case it's email. For example, if you use username, just find by username, and here all I need to do is to pass string email. All right, so this is it. Now we have our repository ready to use. Let's move on to the next steps. When we check again our schema right here and the architecture that we have right here, so we see that the first thing that we will get, or the first thing that will intercept our HTTP request, is the JWT Authentication filter. So let's go ahead and create this filter. So here within our base package, right click right here, new, and I will create a new package. I will call it config. So I want all this to be part of my configuration package, and I will create a JWT authentication filter. I will call it like that. So this is our authentication filter class, and now in order to make it a filter, we have multiple options. Okay, but here, as we can see in the schema right here, we have we want this filter to be active every time we get a request. So every time the user sends a request, we want our filter to get fired and do all the job that we want it to do. Okay, so this one we need to extend a class called once per request filter, and as the name indicates, it will be a filter by one every request. So let me download the data source, and you can see here once per request filter extends already generic filter bean, and this generic filter bean already implements the interface called filter. So for us, we had two options, whether using or extending this once per request filter or implementing the filter interface right here. So it will be the same, but let's use something already provided by Spring, so it's better to use the once per request filter. So now let's implement the methods, and we see here that we have a method called do and filter internal, and we have three parameters: the request, the response, and the filter chain. Let me explain each part of it. I will just inline these parameters right here so you can see all of it. So these are our parameters. So here what we have this HTTP servlet request, the response, and the filter chain. So the request is our request and the response is also our response. So we can intercept every request and extract data from, for example, from the request and provide new data within the response. So for example, if I want to add a header to my response, we can do it using this once per request filter. Okay, and the filter chain is the chain of responsibility design pattern. So it contains the list of the other filters that we need to execute. So when we call this filter chain dot do internal filter or do filter, it will call the next filter within the chain. So here I want just to remove this these warnings. So because these three parameters, they should not be null, and to do so I will just add this non-null annotation, the one from springframework.lang, and I'm gonna copy paste it and move it and put it in here. Okay, so like this we no longer have this warning. And now the last thing to do before moving on and start implementing this, the last thing to do is we need to tell Spring that we want this class to be managed bean, okay, or to become a Spring bean. And to do so we need to annotate it whether with service annotation or component annotation, or also repository. It works because three of them are the same annotation. The repository and the service, they both extend the component, but I will just make it a component right here. And also I will use another Lombok annotation, which is the required args constructor. And this required args constructor, it will create a constructor using any final field that we declare right here. So for example, if I do private final string my string, this annotation, it will create a constructor using this private final field. Okay, so now we have our filter ready to use. Let's now start implementing it part by part. From this diagram right here, we see that the first thing that gets executed, or the first thing we do within this JWT authentication filter, is checking if we have the JWT token. Okay, so let's move on and implement this. All right, to do so, within our method do internal filter, let's try to perform some operations. Okay, so first of all, I will create a string. I will call it authentication header. All right, why? Because when we make a call, we need to pass the JWT authentication token within the header. So it should be within a header called authorization. So what we need to do here is try to extract this header. Okay, so this authentication header is part of our request, and from the request we can call a method called getHeader, and within the header all we need to do is to pass the header name. So our header is called authorization, like that. So this is the header that contains the JWT token, or the bearer token. We call it also bearer token. Okay, all right, so now I will create another variable. Let's also make it final string. I will call it JWT or JWT token, call it whatever you want. So here I want to implement this check that we did before. So we talk about this check JWT token. So let's implement this. So here the test that I want to do is if the authorization header is null, so I want to do an early return, or if not, my authorization header dot starts with, because as I told you, the bearer token should be always, or should start always, with the keyword bearer. Okay, and it should be exactly like that, and then we have a space. So if we don't have these two conditions, all I need to do is call the filter chain dot do filter, and I need to pass the request and the response to the next filter. Okay, and here don't forget to call the return semicolon. So we don't want to continue with the execution of the rest of that one. Okay, so here this is the check that we implemented. Now let's try to extract the token from this header, okay, from this authentication header. The next step is we created already a JWT variable. Now I want to extract this token from my authentication header or from my authorization header, and I want to do a substring starting from the position number 7. And why position number 7? Because if we count this bearer with this space, the count is 7. Okay, so let's move on and check what we need to do next. After checking the JWT token, what we need to do is to call this UserDetails service to check if we have the user already within our database or not. Okay, but to do that, we need to call a JWT service here to extract the user name. All right, so let me show you what we need to do. So right here, I will just go back and create a final string username or email, call it whatever you want. So I'm just gonna call it user email, okay, to be consistent and avoid confusions. So I will call it user email. So after extracting the JWT token, what I need to do is I want to extract also this user email. So this user email equals, and here I will add a to do extract the user email. Okay, but to do so, I need to extract it from, let me add it here, from JWT token. So to extract from this user email from the token, I need a class that can manipulate this JWT token. Okay, so let's try now to implement this class. This class, I will call it here, I will just create my class here, private final, I will call it JWT service. So I don't have yet this JWT service, but within this JWT service, what I want to do here, I want to use a method that I will call it, for example, JWT.extract username. Okay, so let me call this JWT service dot extract user name or user email. Okay, let's keep it username within the JWT because mainly with Spring Security we talk about user names. And to extract this one, I need to pass the JWT as a parameter. Okay, so I will create this class. Now I will ask IntelliJ to create this class JWT service, and I will create it. You can keep it with the config package, or you can move it to a different one. So I will keep it within this package, and also do not forget to add this service annotation to make it or to transform it to a managed bean. All right. So now I will just create this extract username method. So create method extract username in JWT service, and yes, this is what I want to do. I need a method that will return a string username, and it takes as a parameter a string token or string JWT. Okay, so let me call this one token. I think it would be better as a name, and yeah, that's it. So I will just return null for the moment. And let's move on, and I will show you how we can implement or how we can extract this information from our JWT service. So now, in order to be able to manipulate JWT tokens, generating one, extracting information from the token, validating the token, and so on and so forth, we need to include new dependencies within our application. So let's go open our pom.xml file, and here within this pom.xml, scroll down and go next to the Lombok or PostgreSQL dependency, and here just add a new dependency, and this the first one called JWT API-API, and it's from io.json Web Token. Okay, and the recent version at this time is the 0.11.5, so let's use this one. We need also to add another dependency, which is also from the same artifact or from the same group ID, but it's a different artifact. So we need a JWT implementation. So it's called JWT amp, and from the same group ID, also the same version. You can extract this version to a property and use it from there. And next we need a final dependency, which is the JWT Jackson. Okay, so also from the same group ID and the same version too. Now, once you add these dependencies or any dependency to your pom.xml, or if you make any updates to your pom.xml, make sure you click this button, load Maven project. But also, if you don't see this button, just right click inside the pom.xml file, Maven, and then you have the option reload project. Okay, so IntelliJ will download all the dependencies and add them to the class path. All right, so our dependencies are ready to use. Now we will go back and implement this JWT service. So before we go and implement all the services and dive too much into the code, let's first try to understand what is a JWT token. So a JWT token stands for a JSON Web Token, which is a compact URL safe means of representing claims to be transferred between two parties. The claims in JWT are encoded as JSON object that is digitally signed using a JSON web signature. Okay, so the JWT consists of three parts. So here we have the header, we have the payload, and also we have the signature. So the header typically consists of two parts. The first one is the type of the token, which is JWT, and the sign-in algorithm being used, such as, for example, HMAC or SH256 or RSA. Okay. The second part of the token is the payload, which contains the claims. Claims are statements about an entity, typically the user, and additional data. So as we can see here, we have the subject, we have the name, we have this IAT, we can have also extra information like authorities or extra claims right here. Okay, so there are three types of claims: registered, public, and private claims. The registered claims are a set of predefined claims which are not mandatory but recommended to provide a set of useful interoperable claims. Some of the registered claims are ISS or the issuer. We also have the subject, the odd, the EXP, like the expiration time, and so on and so forth. This we will see when we will implement the token generations. Okay, we have also the public claims, which are the claims that are defined within the IANA JSON Web Token registry or public by nature. Private claims are custom claims created to share information between parties that agree using them. Okay. The last one, or the third part of the token, is the signature, which is used to verify the sender of the JWT is who it is claims to be, and to ensure that the message wasn't changed along the way. Okay, so now let's move on to the code and see how we can generate or how we can extract claims from this JWT token. Okay, so also within this JWT.io website, you can play with the payload. You can add some information here, and as you can see, everything you add every time you add something, you see that it changes right here. Okay, let's move on and go back to our code. Now, before start implementing this extract username method, I want to implement or write some code to extract all the claims, and also another method that allow us to extract one single claim. Okay, so first of all, I want to create this method. It will return a claims. And these claims, if you see right here, when you click on import class, it's the one from io.jsonwebtoken.claims. It's the dependency that we just added. So these claims, I will call this method extract all claims. Okay, so this extract all claims, of course, it will take a string token as parameter. And now I will show you how to extract this. So to do it, we need to return our JWTS, and this JWTS is also from the io.json web token, and we need this JWTS.parse builder. And in order to parse this builder, or to parse the token, and here we need to set the signing key. Okay, set signing key, because as we mentioned before, when we try to generate or to decode a token, we need to use the signing key. So I will here just call this one get signing key, and I will explain it later on. We will implement this method, and then we need to build, because it's a builder. And once the object is built, we can call the method parse claims JWS. Okay, so this method parse claims JWS. So we want to parse our token, and once the token is parsed, we can call the method get body. Okay, so within the get body, we can get all the claims that we have within this token right here. All right, so now before we implement this signing key method, which should return a key, as you can see in the definition here, so this one, let's first understand what is a signing key. Okay, so in the context of JSON Web Tokens, a signing key is a secret that is used to digitally sign the JWT. The signing key is used to create the signature part of the JWT, which is used to verify that the sender of the JWT is who it claims to be, and ensure that the message wasn't changed along the way. So we want to ensure that the same person or the same client that is sending this JWT key is the one that claims who to be. Okay, so the signing key is used in conjunction with the sign-in algorithm specified in the JWT header to create the signature. The specific sign-in algorithm and key size will depend on the security requirement of your application and the level of trust you have in the sign-in party. Okay, so here, in order to do that, first of all, we need to go ahead and generate a new token, or a new signing key, or a secret key. Okay, so to generate this secret key, we can do it online, because now we like for security reasons, we need at least, or like the minimum, a signing key of size 256. Okay, so, and in order to generate a key, so you don't need to worry about this, there are so many tools and online tools to do this. So here I will just go ahead and create a private static final string. I will call it secret key, and this secret key equals the value that I will generate right now. Okay, so now go to the browser and navigate to this address, which is allkeysgenerator.com, and then /random/security encryption key generator .aspx. Okay, and we have here encryption keys, and here we have also the security level. So as I mentioned, the minimum required for JWT tokens is 256-bit. Okay, and then click on this checkbox, yes, the eggs, make it check it and make it yes, so we can get this X secret key. Okay, so if you need more security, just go ahead, change it, and do like you can go even up to 4096 bits. Okay, but for now, for the sake of this tutorial, I will just make it or leave it to 256 bits. Okay, now let's go back to our code and paste this code right here, or this key right here. Also, you can move it to the application properties and use it from there. All right, now let's continue and let's implement this get signing key. So here I will use IntelliJ to auto generate or to create this method. So I will ask him to create this method, and this method should return not byte, but it should return a key. Okay, so now to do this, first of all, I need to create or to make an object or a variable of type byte. I will call it key bytes, and this one equals decoders and the dot base 64, because it's a base, we want to decode it on base 64 dot decode, and we want to decode our secret key. Okay, so once the secret key is decoded, now I need to do just to return keys dot HMAC SHA-key4. This is one of the algorithms that we mentioned before, and all I need to do is to pass these key bytes. Right, so now we have our get signing key method, and we have also this extract all claims method ready to use. Now we have extract all claims method ready to use. I will go ahead next and implement another method which will allow me, or which can extract a single claim that we pass. Okay, so I will use genericity for this. So I will use a public T. I want it to be a generic method, and I will call it extract claim. And for this claim, I need, of course, the token, the key token or string token, and then I want to pass a function, the one from JWTs, and this function is of type claims, and T, which is the type that I want to return. Okay, I will call it claim resolver or claims resolver, or claim, call it whatever you want, resolver. And here it's a simple method. I will create a final claims object. I will call it claims equals extract all claims from my token. Okay, so first of all, I want to extract all the claims, and then I want to do return this claim resolver, the function that I pass as parameter dot apply. And as you can see, the apply, it will take, or it will require a claims T. So the claims is the one of the list of all the claims that we have. Okay, so this is the extract all claims method. Now extracting any claim from my token will be an easy peasy task. So I will show you how to do that. So once I have everything ready, extracting all the claims and also extracting one single claim, let me show you how we can extract the username out of this token. Okay, so extracting a username is easy peasy. So it will be extract claim, and we need to pass the token, and only we need to pass the claims dot get subject. Okay, so because as I mentioned before, the subject is or should be the email or the username of my user. Okay, so this should be the subject of the token. So that's it. This is only all about extracting the username. Let's now move on and try to implement other methods that we will need within this JWT service class, like testing if the token is expired, also extracting the expiration date, generating the token, and so on and so forth. Let's now implement the method that will help us generate a token. So the token, as you know, is a string. So I will create a public string method and I will call it generate token. All right, so this generate token will take as parameter a map of string and object. Okay, and this map of string object will contain the claims or the extra claims that we want to add. Okay, I will call it claims or like extra claims. I think it's better to call it extra claims. And also I want to pass my user details. So here user details, and it's the one from the Spring framework. I will just call it user or user details. All right, so this is the method, and here this extra claims is the one if I want, for example, I don't know, to pass authorities, to pass any information that I want to store within my token. All right, so to do this, it's easy peasy. It's just return JWTs dot builder, and then I want to set my claims. So these are my claims, and those will be the extra claims. Okay, so extra claims, and after passing the claims, I need to set my subject. So the subject, as I mentioned before, it should be my username or user email. Okay, so I will use the object user details dot get username. All right, so because for us the username or the unique part of the user is the email, but for Spring it's always called username. That's why we are using username. Okay, so also we need to set the issued at, means the when this claim was created, and this information will help us to calculate the expiration date or to check if the token is still valid or not. Okay, so I will use a new date right here, and I will pass just the system dot current milliseconds. Okay, so this is the issue date, and I want also to set the expiration date. So the expiration date, it will be the same, a new date, and here like it's up to you to set how long this token should be valid. Okay, so also system dot get dot current milliseconds, and then for example I want to add let's say 1000 times 60, which is 60 minutes, times 24. So my token, for example, will be valid for 24 hours plus 1000 milliseconds. Okay, and then you can decide or you can set any expiration date that suits you. Okay, the final step is to sign with like which key that we want to use to sign this token, and the signing key is the get signing key method that we already created before. And then we need to pass also the signature algorithm. So signature algorithm, and then we want to use the HS256. Okay, so it's this one. So let's select it, and then finally call the method compact. Compact is the one that will generate and return the token. So as you can see, this is how we can generate a token out of extra claims and the user details. All right, so now this method will like we don't have a choice but passing claims and user details. But what if I want to pass, or I want to use, or I want to generate a token without having, or without extra claims? I only want to generate a token from the user details itself. So it's easy peasy. I will create another one, public string. I'll give it the same name, generate token, and this generate token, it will take it. I will pass only user details as a parameter, and here I will just return generate token out of null, or let's say a new hash map, like an empty one, and then user details. Okay, so now I have this generate token method that I can use later on. Okay. As a next step, let's implement a method that will validate, or can validate, a token. Okay, so I will create a boolean and I will call it is token valid. All right, and this method is token valid will take two parameters as input, which is the token itself and the user details. Why we need the user details? Because we want to validate if this token right here belongs to this user details right here. Okay, so first of all, I need a final string username or user email, but within the context of this JWT service, let's stick to username, and this one, it will be extract username out of the token. We already have the method for that. And then what we want to do is to return if or whether the username that we have right here equals the user details dot get username. All right, so we want to make sure that the username we have within the token is the same as the username we have as input. Okay, and I want to make sure is token expired. Like I need to check that my token is not expired. Okay, and I want to pass my token as parameter. So this is token expired. This is a method that we need to create. So let me go ahead and create this token expired, and let's implement this token. Okay, so I want, for this is token expired, I will create a method. I will call it extract expiration from the token that we have dot before, because it's a date, so I want to make sure that it's before today's date. Okay, before new date. Now let's create this extract expiration. So this extract expiration should return a date, and it passes as a parameter the token itself. So it's also easy. So it's extract claim from the token, and then it's claims dot or colon get expiration. Okay, so this is how we can extract the expiration date. All right, so how we have here, if the is token expired, we have the is token valid, we have all the methods that we need. So is token valid, this one we will use it later on. So now let's move on and go back, finish implementing this authentication filter. So here we just finished implementing this JWT validation process or validation service right here. And now we want to go back to this validate JWT process. So within our code, what we did here, we extracted our username. So we have now our username valid. Let's go ahead and perform or finish our validation process. All right, so here I want to check if my user email is not null. So I have a user email, or I can extract my user email out of my JWT token, and I want to check something else. I want to check that the user is not authenticated yet, because if the user is authenticated, I don't need to perform again all the checks and setting and updating the security context and so on and so forth. So here I want to check if the user is already authenticated. I don't need to do all this process and so on and so forth. All I need to do is pass here and leave it to the dispatcher servlet. Okay, so to do that, or to check if the user is already connected or is already authenticated or not, we have an object called security context holder, and from that we can get the context, and then we have a method called get authentication. And when the authentication is null, means that the user is not yet authenticated. Okay, so this means that the user is not connected yet. All right, so once the user is not connected, what we need to do here, like when we go back to follow this process, we need to perform and to check or get the user from the database. All right, so once we do this validation process, we want also, or we need to check if we have the user within the database. All right, so to do so, I will create an object called UserDetails, or you can just call it user, because our user already extends or implements the UserDetails interface. I will call it UserDetails equals, and here I will use this dot user details service, which we don't have yet, and here we have a method load by username. Okay, and my username in this case is the user email. All right, so here the method called load user by username. And in this case, we don't have this user details service, but let's create one here. So this user details service is already an interface within the Spring, available within the Spring framework, and it's from Spring Framework Security Core and so on and so forth. And I will call it user details service. So this interface, if we check it right here, so here we have some implementation for it. Okay, but we want our own implementation because we want to fetch our user from our database. All right, so make this one final, don't forget this. And let's move on and implement or provide a bean of type user details service. At this level, we need to create a bean of type user details service, or we need to create a class that implements this interface. So, and also give it the service or component annotation, so it becomes a managed bean and Spring will be able to inject it. But let's do it in a fancy way. Within this config package, I will create a class. I will call it application config. So this application config will hold all the application configurations such as beans and so on and so forth. All right, so to make this class a configuration, we need to annotate it with the annotation called configuration. So at the startup, Spring will pick up this class and try to implement and inject all the beans that we will declare within this application config. All right, we also need the required Args constructor in case we want to inject something. So what we need to do now is to implement or to create a bean of type user details service. And to do so, first of all, we need to use the annotation bean. This to indicate to Spring that this method represents a bean, and a bean always should be public, no private beans. And our bean is of type user details service. Okay, so let's call it user details service, as easy as that or as simple as that. And then we can use a lambda expression. So we can use, or we can say, return a new user details service, and we implement the load user by username. So we can do like that, new user details service, like this, and automatically you will see here that we have this load user by username method, the one that we want to use in here. This method right here, okay? But we can make it more simple than that, and we can use a lambda expression. And the lambda expression, it looks like that. So here we already see that IntelliJ is proposing to replace this with a lambda. So we'll just go ahead and click on it. So the lambda is the username. So we provide the username, the one we have as an input within this method right here, and then we need to provide the implementation. Okay, so in this case, what we want to do is to fetch the user, or to get the user from the database. And to do that, we need to inject our user repository. Okay, so let's create a private final user repository. Let's call it repository or user repository. And here, simply what we need to return is user repository dot find by email, the method that we created when we just created the user repository. And find by email, we need to pass the user name. Okay, and since the find by email returns an optional of user, here I want to add an or else throw. So in case we don't have, or we don't find the username or the user within our database, we need to return an exception of type, whether entity not found exception, or we can also return the exception username not found exception. Okay, so I will use the username not found exception, and I will just provide here, it should be also a lambda. And for example, as a message, we can say user not found. All right, so here now we have our user details service. So now it's ready to use. Let's continue implementing our JWT authentication filter. Now we can go back to our filter and finish the implementation. All right, so here we have our user details, or we have our user, and the next step is to validate and check if the token is still valid or not. So here I will add if JWT service dot is token valid. Okay, and here I need to pass my JWT and the user details that I just got from the database. All right, so if the token is valid, then what I need to do, I need, like we have in here, we need, if the user is valid, we need to update the security context and send the request to our dispatcher servlet. Okay. All right. So once our token is valid, I need to create an object of type username password authentication token. So username password authentication token, I will call it auth token, and this object is needed by Spring and by the security context holder in order to update our security context. Okay, so equals a new username and password authentication token, and it takes as parameter the user details, and then for the next parameter for the authorities, I want to pass it as null, and then the user details dot get authorities. So here, because we don't have credentials, as you remember when we created the user, we don't have credentials, so that's why I'm passing these credentials as a null value. So once I finish creating or finish instantiating this username authentication token, I want also to give it some more details. So I will use the auth token dot set details, and these details, it takes an object. So I will pass a new object of type new web authentication details source. Authentication details source. And here I want to build the details out of our request, out of our HTTP request. All right, now the final step is, as we mentioned here, the final step is to update the security context holder. So to update the security context holder, it's security context holder dot get context dot set authentication with our authentication token. All right, and that's it. Now let's recap this one. So here, if we have our user email and the user is not authenticated, we get the user details from the database, and then what we need to do, we check if the user is valid or not. If the user and the token is valid, so we create an object of type username password authentication token. We pass user details, credentials, and the authorities as parameter, and then we extend or we enforce this authentication token with the details of our request, and then we update the authentication token. And don't forget, as a last step, and always think about after this if, think about always calling our filter chain dot do filter. So we need always to pass the hand to the next filters to be executed. Okay, and here we need the request and the response. And that's it about our JWT authentication filter. It is ready to use. Let's move on and see what we need to implement next. This whole process is now implemented, but we still need to do some extra steps. The extra step we need to do is to tell Spring which configuration that we want to use in order to make all this works. Okay, so we created the filter, we implemented the UserDetails service, validation, updating context, and so forth. But what we are missing is the binding. We need to bind, because we created a filter, but this filter is not yet used, so we need to use it. And in order to do that, we need to create a new configuration class. I will call it security configuration. Okay, so I will call this class security config or configuration, and this is gonna be our security configuration class. And as always, to make a configuration class become a configuration, we need to add this configuration annotation from Spring. Also, because we talk about security right here, we need to enable web security. Let me make it full screen. And again, we will need the required args constructor. So these two annotations, they need to be together when we work with Spring Boot 3.0. Okay, so next, what I will need to do, because as at the startup or at the application startup, Spring security will try to look for a bean of type security filter chain. And this security filter chain is the bean responsible of configuring all the HTTP security of our application. So I will create a bean public security filter chain. I will call it security filter chain, and within this method or with this bean, I will pass a parameter of type HTTP security. I will call it just HTTP, just for a short variable name. Now let's start configuring our HTTP security. So here, as you can see, it's of type security filter chain. And to do that, let's first return http.build. And here we need to add also the exception to the method signature, because this build might throw an exception. All right, so now to do the configuration, I will start by I will first disable the CSRF verification, and we might talk about this in a different video. So here now, once we disable this one, and now let's move on, or we will implement the configuration, the real configuration. So within the security, we can choose and decide what are the URLs and the paths that we want to secure. But of course, within every application, we have always a whitelist. A whitelist means that we have some endpoints that they do not require any authentication or any tokens which are open. For example, when we talk about creating an account and logging, so in this case, to create an account, we don't need a JWT token, because at that time we will create a user account and we will require, or will ask for, a token after that. Also the same when we want to log in, we don't need to pass the token as parameter because we don't have one yet. So in this case, this is when we talk about whitelisting. And here is how we can implement whitelisting. So after disabling the CSRF, I want to authorize HTTP requests. And after using or calling this authorized HTTP request, here we can call a request matcher dot request matchers. And for this request matchers, we can pass a list of strings and a list of patterns. This will represent the application or our application patterns. We will go back to this later on. And for this list, I want to permit all. I want all the requests in here, all this list, I want to permit all. Okay, and then any request, all the other requests, I want them to be authenticated. So this means I want to whitelist this list and authorize all the requests within this list, but any other request should be authenticated. Okay, now let's talk about and let's see how we can configure our session management. The session management means what? We said that when we implemented the filter, we want a once per request filter. Means every request should be authenticated. This means that we should not store the authentication state, or the session state should not be stored. So the session should be stateless. And this will help us ensure that each request should be authenticated. Okay, so now we use the and to add a new configuration, and here let's add dot session management. And here I want to talk about the session creation policy, how we want to create our session. So as I mentioned, our session, we want it to be stateless session. Okay, so I will use session creation policy dot stateless, and like this, Spring will create a new session for each request. And then here I need to tell Spring which authentication provider that I want to use. The authentication provider, I will explain it in just a few seconds. Okay, so I will just add it, authentication provider, and I will create an object of type authentication provider. And then I will go back and create it later on. And then after the authentication provider, I want now to use the JWT filter that we just created. Okay, so to do that, I will use the method add filter before, because I want to execute this filter before the filter called username password authentication filter. Because as you remember, when we implemented the JWT authentication filter, we check everything, and then we set the security context. We update the security context holder, and after that we will be calling the username password authentication filter. Okay, so here I will use JWT auth filter. I will call it like that, and I want it before the username password authentication filter.class. Okay, now let me create this object. So I will use the not local variable, but create a field, and this one I want it to be of type JWT authentication filter. Okay, so this is the first one, and I need it to be final, so it will be automatically injected by Spring. And the next one is the authentication provider. So let's create a field of type authentication provider, and let's make it final too. Alright, so now I have my configuration ready. All I need to do, or I need to implement now, is this authentication provider, and let's do it right now. Now we need to provide this authentication provider bean. So let's go to our application config class, and let's create a new bean of type authentication provider. Okay, so for this authentication provider, let me make this full screen. So I want to create a bean, and always public, and the bean type authentication provider. Authentication provider, always from the Spring Framework package, and I will call it authentication provider. And let's start implementing this bean right now. So this authentication provider is the data access object, which is responsible to fetch the user details and also encode password and so on and so forth. So for this we have, for this authentication provider, we have many implementations, and one of them is the DAO authentication provider. So data access object authentication provider, I will call it auth provider equals new DAO authentication provider. Okay, so within this authentication provider we need to specify few properties, or like not few but just two of them. And the first one is the user details service. So we need to tell this authentication provider which user details service to use in order to fetch information about our user, because we might have multiple implementations of the user details. One, for example, getting the information from the database, another one based on a different profile, fetching the users from in-memory database, from LDAP, and so on and so forth. Okay, so for this one we already have our user details service right here. So this one is referencing this method. Next, we need to provide a password encoder. So which password encoder we are using within our application. So if you have a specific one, or if you are using specific one, you need also to precise this one, because when we want to try or we want to authenticate a user, we need to know which password encoder in order to be able to decode the password using the correct algorithm. Okay, so auth provider dot set password encoder, and here I will create a method. I will call it password encoder. Okay, and I will create a bean out of it later on. So this is the minimum required information that we need to provide, and then all I need to do is returning this auth provider right here. Now I will just go ahead and create this password encoder. So this password encoder is should be also a bean. So it will be public, and I will give it the bean annotation. And for this, I just need to return a new bcrypt password encoder. And that's it. So now I have my authentication provider, and also I created the password encoder bean. One more step is needed to finish this application config class, which is the authentication manager. And the authentication manager, as the name indicates, is the one responsible to manage the authentication. So the authentication manager has a bunch of methods, and one of them, there is a method that allow us or help us to authenticate a user based or using just the username and password. And for that, we need also to create a bean or to provide a bean to be able to use it later on. Okay, so I will create a bean and public authentication manager, because this is the bean that I want to create, and I will call it authentication manager. And within this bean, I want to inject an object of type authentication configuration. Okay, and I will call it config. This authentication configuration holds already the information about the authentication manager. So I will just return config.get authentication manager. All right, so here we are using the default implementation of Spring Boot, and this is more than sufficient for us. Here, don't forget also to add the exception to the method signature. So that's it. Let's move on. And now we're done with all the security configuration for our application, but we still need to provide at least 2 endpoints where the user can create an account or also can authenticate. And to do so, within the base package, I will create a package. I will call it auth. And within this package, I will create a new controller, authentication controller. And this authentication controller will have 2 endpoints that will allow me to create or register a new account and authenticate an existing user. So in order to call this or to make this class a controller, we need this annotation rest controller. And also I will give it a request mapping. And for the request mapping, it will be /API/v1/auth. And also I will need the required args constructor. Okay, now within this authentication controller, I will create 2 endpoints, one for register and the other one for the authenticate. So the first one, it will be a post mapping, and I will give it a register for the name, and here it will be a public response entity, and now the type will be authentication response. I will create an object later on for that. We will call this method register, and this register will need a request body, and this request body, I will create an object called register request, which will hold all the request or the registration information like first name, last name, email, and password. Okay, so I will leave it empty for now. We will implement it later on. I will do the same. I will just copy paste this one, and I will create another method, but this one we call it authenticate, and it will also return an authentication response, but instead of register request, we will need an authentication request. Okay, so it's an authentication request. Yeah, that's it. So we have our controller ready now. Let's move on and start implementing things. Let's now create our authentication response. So now I will use IntelliJ to create this class authentication response, and I will create it within the same package. So this response is a simple class that will have only a string token. So this is the token that would be sent back to the customer or to the user. And to do that, we will need this data annotation, we'll need the builder, and of course the all-args constructor and the no-args constructor. So that's it. So our authentication response is ready. Let's move on and create the register request. Now let's create this register request class. So create a class right here, and we will create it within the same package. So this register request, it will also have few attributes like private string first name, private string last name, and also an email and password. So we will also need the same annotations as we used within this authentication response. So just go ahead and copy them and put them within this register request. Okay, so now we have also our object register request ready. I will create as a next step the authentication request object. Finally, we need to create this authentication request within the same package. So I will just paste the same annotations, and here this object will hold only two information, which is the string email and string password. Okay, so that's it. Our object now ready. Let's move on and start implementing this register and authenticate request. So for the registration and authentication implementation, I will delegate this to a service. So within this auth package, I will create a new class and I will call it authentication service. All right, this is the place or the class where I will implement these two methods, register and authenticate. So here I will just give it the service annotation and of course the required args constructor. All right, so here we have these two methods. I will just move on and here just make a simple call for this service methods, but first let's inject it. Okay, so I will need private final authentication service. I will call it just service right here. And within this authentication service, let me make this full screen. Now I will just make the return statements for these two methods. All right, so here I will return a response entity dot OK, and I will call my service dot register, and I will pass this request as parameter. Okay, and I will copy paste this and paste it right here, and instead of register it will be authenticate. So here we don't have yet our register and authenticate method, so let's go ahead and create them. So create method register, and this one will return the authentication response. So this is what we want to return. And now we can also create this authenticate method, and the same, it should return an authentication response. Alright, so now I will start implementing these methods. So now let's implement this register method, and this register will allow us to create a user, save it to the database, and return the generated token out of it. Okay, so for that, because we need or we want to interact with the database and save the user, so the first thing that we need is to inject our repository. Let's call it repository right here. And then what we need to do, I want to create a user object out of this register request. So I will create a var user equals user.builder and here .build. So to build this user out of this register request, so I will have the first name, which is request.getFirstName, same for the last name, and same for email. So it's email, and then the value will be the request.getEmail. Now for the password, as you remember, we created our bean of type password encoder. So for this, we need to encode our password before saving it to the database. Okay, so in order to encode the password, we need first of all to inject our password encoder service. So I will do that. Password encoder, and this I will use it right here, password encoder.encode, and here I have the get password or the request.get password that we will receive within the registration request. Okay, so here I will just make a static role always. So I will use a user role, and then we call the build method. All right. So once we build our user object, the next step we need to do is our repository.save, and we want to save the user that we just created. All right. And finally, to return this authentication response that contains the token, I will create a new variable. I will call it JWT token equals. Now I will need my JWT service to generate that token. So I will inject also the private final JWT service, and I will use it to create or to generate the token using this user object right here. So JWT service.generate token, the one only using user details. For the moment, I don't need to set any extra claims. So I will use this user object to create or to generate a token. And finally, I will return an object of type authentication response .builder.build, and I need to pass .token, or I need to pass the token that I just generated. Okay, so this is the register method, and now everything is implemented. Let's move on and implement this authenticate. For the authentication, it's easy peasy. So you remember we spoke before about the authentication manager bean, and we said that this authentication manager bean has a method called authenticate, which allow us to authenticate a user based on the username and password. So for that, I will inject first of all my private final authentication manager bean. I will call it authentication manager. All right, so I will go back here to this authenticate method, and to authenticate the user, all I need to do is to call the authentication manager.authenticate, and this authentication manager takes an object of type username password authentication token. So I will pass a new username password authentication token, and within this I need to pass the email. So request.get email and also the password. Request.get password, and this authentication manager will do all the job for me. And in case the user is not the username or the password are not correct, so an exception will be thrown. All right, so I'm totally secure when I just call this method. Otherwise, what I need to do, I need to create a user, and if the user, so if I, first of all, if I get to this point right here, means the user is authenticated. So means the username and password are correct. If both of them are correct, so I will just need to generate a token and send it back. Okay, so I will first of all try to get the user and find by email, and I will use the request.getEmail, and here or else I will just throw. Okay, I'll just throw any exception, like it's not so important at this level. But for you, you might want to throw the correct exception, and you need to catch it, handle the exceptions, and so on and so forth. All right, so now I will just go ahead and copy this code because it will be the same, and put it right here. So once I get the user, I will generate a token using this user object and then return this authentication response. So now we have this authenticate method and the register methods ready to use. Let's move on and see what is the next step. Now we have our authentication controller ready to use, but there is one extra step that we need to do. Do you remember when we first implemented the security configuration and we spoke about this whitelist right here? So what we need to provide now within this request matchers that we want to permit all, we need to provide or authorize all the URLs or all the methods that we have within this authentication controller. So go ahead, copy the request mapping that you created, and for example here I want to authorize all the methods that I have within this authentication controller. Why? Because based on my design, everything that I have in here only authentication related methods. So I don't have any business logic methods or endpoints within this authentication controller. So that's why I'm allowing all the methods within this controller. So that's it. Now let's create a demo controller for that. I will create a new controller within a new package. So right click here, new class, and I will call the package demo, and I will call it demo controller. So this demo controller will be also secured. So I want this endpoint to be secured. I will copy this these annotations right here, paste it here, and so this one will be demo, and let's call it demo controller. And now I will create just a get mapping, a simple method that will return a simple string. Okay, response entity of type string, say hello for example, and then I will just return a response entity.ok and with a body, hello from secured endpoint, and that's it. Now let's go ahead, start our application and test these changes. Let's start the application and make sure that all the code that we wrote together is working fine. So go ahead, click on start, and let's see what we will have in the console. So let's make sure that everything is fine. So as you can see here from the logs, we no longer have this auto-generated password by Spring Security, and we have here that we are creating the sequence, and we have the table user gets created, and the application is running correctly. Okay, so now let's start our Postman and test this endpoint. So I have my Postman started right now, so I will use this endpoint within a GET request. So the endpoint is localhost and my port is 8080/API/v1/demo controller is the same one that I have right here within my code. It's demo controller, and now I will click on send. We see that we have no authorization, we have nothing in here. So I will just go ahead and click on send, and normally, like, the expected behavior is this endpoint should be secured. Okay, so when I click on send, we exactly can see that we have a 403 forbidden, means that we are not allowed to access this endpoint. Okay, next we have our two endpoints, the authenticate and the register. So let's first start with this register endpoint. Or before that, let's start with the authenticate. And for the authenticate, now we know that we have no user within our database. We can also double check that. So if I open, let me close the other tabs. So here I don't have any user registered within my database. Okay, but now if I try to connect to authenticate a non-existing user, I also expect to have a 403 as a response. And this is what we see right here. So it's 403 forbidden, and the user is not allowed to access this endpoint. And this why? Because we have here within our schema, so we try to check and validate everything, even if the endpoint is secured. So we get into this authentication filter, we validate everything, but once we get to the user details, we don't have the user in the database. So in that case, we will send back a 403 to our customer. Okay, so now let's create a new user. So I will register a new user. So I give it Alibu as a first name, Alibu last name, and alibu@mail.com and 1234 as a password. So now when I click the send button, I should get a generated token or a JWT token as a response. So this is what we see right here. So I will just copy this token, and I want to decode it, and let's see what we have within this token. So let's go back to the JWT.io website and paste the generated token in here. So we see that we have the algorithm here, which is the HS256, the one we use to generate this token, and we have our payload. So we set already the subject to the user email, and we have the issued at. So the creation date, and as you can see in here, it was created December 29 at 14:14, and this one will expire in 24 hours. Okay, so this is our generated token. Let's go back and test the authentication right now. So we see that the register is working, but let's ensure that within this same username and password, we are also able to get a token or to generate a token. So this is the same email and the password that we have, and if I click on send, I should get the token. But let's first try with a wrong password. So when I click on send, so here we have our 403, and here it's because of this process. So we have the token, and then we start the validation process. So we extract the username and password, and then we are calling the user details service to try to fetch the user from the database. And the user, we got it because the user already exists. But when we move to the security filter chain and when we move to security context holder, we will try also to use the authentication manager to authenticate that user using the password and the username that were provided within the request. But this password is wrong, so that's why we are also throwing a 403 as a response. Okay, so now let's test with a correct password. So if I click on send, I see that I have my JWT token. I will copy this one, and then I will go back to this get method. I will click again and make sure that it's always 403, and how we can authorize this request right now. So within the authorization, here within the type, click and choose bearer token. All right, so remove or delete if you have something in here, and paste the token that you just copied. Okay, now click on send, and we see that we have the message hello from secured endpoint, and we have this 200 OK, which is compatible with all this process. So we have the filter, we validate everything, we check the token, user details, and then we pass everything to the security context holder, we update it, and then our request is sent to the dispatcher servlet, hit the controller, and then we get our response back. So I hope this was clear. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to drop a comment, and especially don't forget to follow me to learn more and more about Spring Boot.
Okie dokie. Congratulations. Now you know how to implement JWT using Spring Boot 3, which is the latest version of Spring Boot, and Spring Security as well. If you enjoyed this crash course, literally just take 1 second and smash the like button. Also, if you haven't subscribed to Ali Boot channel, go ahead and subscribe. He's got awesome content around Spring Boot, Java, and Angular. It was a pleasure. This is all for now, and I'll catch you on the next one. Assalamu alaikum.